Mosaic, a daily news program from Link TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
قالت عائلة الراهنة البريطاني كينيث بيغلي الذي اختطف في العراق الشهر الماضي.
The family of the British hostage, Kenneth Beagley, who was abducted last month in Iraq, announced that they have evidence that he has been killed. According to fighters in Fallujah, the British hostage, Kenneth Beagley, was beheaded yesterday in the town of Itafiyah, south of Baghdad, by the Tawhid and Jihad group in Iraq. This group is under the command of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and has claimed responsibility for abducting Beagley, along with two other Americans who were beheaded only days after being kidnapped. Beagley was 62 years old and was kidnapped on September 16, 2004.
أعلن الجيش الأمريكي مقتل جندي أمريكي وإصابة 2 آخرين بجروح في شمال
The U.S. Army announced the death of a U.S. soldier and the injury of 2 others in northern Iraq. A U.S. airstrike on Fallujah kills 11 people and wounds 17 others. According to Iraqi medical sources, one of the houses was hit shortly after a wedding party had ended, thus killing and wounding a large number of women and children.
However,
the U.S. forces declared that the house is believed to harbor members of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's group, adding that they were using it to plan attacks in Iraq. Meanwhile, the United States is advising its citizens to leave Taba after the attack on the hotel that killed 28 people and wounded dozens of others, noting that many people are still missing. According to an Israeli medical official, the possibility of finding survivors under the ruins is minimal. The scene is not surprising. Israeli ambulances crossed the border to aid in the rescue. The number of victims depicts the power of the explosion. This is a familiar scene to the paramedics working at the site. The majority of tourists in this area are Israelis. Now they are in total shock and have been rushing to the border to cross into Israel, trying to avoid another horrifying surprise.
The first explosion, I heard an explosion and a large bang. I couldn't believe what was happening. Now we're going back to our country. We heard it.
Until now, the number of victims has not been confirmed, but what we know is that the majority of victims are Israelis. Debris is still being removed and more bodies are being discovered. Some are totally disfigured.
Some bodies were totally charred and we can't identify them at all. It is confirmed that about 5 or 6 Egyptians were killed in the blast.
The initial investigation of the incident reveals that it was executed by car bombs. However, there is controversy surrounding the group and the purpose behind this attack. Nevertheless, fingers are pointing toward Al-Qaeda, noting that 10 days ago, a warning was issued advising citizens of the possibility of such an attack.
This may be interpreted as if a certain group of tourists were targeted due to the timing and location of the attack.
The future repercussions of this incident cannot be evaluated now. The situation is larger than this destruction. We must take into account the political and economic effects as well. Hani Amara at the Taba Resort.
Rescue workers say that at least 27 people, including many Israelis, were killed in last night's bombings attacks in the Hilton Hotel in Taba and Ras Satan, 50 kilometers to the south. 25 bodies have already been pulled from the rubble of the Taba Hilton, and Magen David Adom has collected the bodies of 2 Israelis killed in Ras Satan. As of this hour, 38 Israelis are reported missing. More on the attacks and the rescue operations in this report from Dennis Zinn.
For the last 18 hours, thousands of anxious and distressed Israelis have been pouring through the Taba border crossing with Egypt, having had their vacation cut short by last night's terror attack in the Sinai coast. A large IDF force comprised of over 70 members of the Home Front's rescue unit is working around the clock using sniffer dogs, heavy machinery and specialized equipment to search for survivors and extract bodies from the ruins of the collapsed Hilton Taba Hotel. 11 buses and 3 ambulances returned from the Ras Al Amud site near Nuweiba, carrying the injured to hospital and holidaymakers who were stranded at the Red Sea Bedouin resort. Police forensic experts who flew into Eilat this morning began identifying the first 5 bodies which were extracted from the Egyptian hotel in Taba. Israeli rescue officials at Taba this morning said an acceptable modus operandi had been worked out with the Egyptian authorities, which relieved much of the frustration that had developed during the night. At around 9:45 last night, 2 explosions ripped through the Taba Hilton Hotel, which was fully booked with tourists, mainly from Israel. One wing of the building collapsed and a fire raged through the ruins. The blasts were caused by explosive-laden vehicles which were parked outside the hotel. As news of the attack filtered into Israel, a large medical and rescue team assembled on the border with Egypt. It was clear that the local Egyptian authorities would not be able to cope with a disaster of such magnitude. However, hours passed before the first rescue teams were allowed to cross the border by the Egyptians. At first, only firefighters with valid passports were allowed through.
I was in the first team with another 2 or 3 trucks. We arrived, we saw lots of fire and lots of cars running and on fire also. The building looked like a war zone.
Frantic telephone calls between Jerusalem, Cairo and Taba eventually eased the situation, and slowly the Egyptian bureaucracy adapted itself to allowing moderately fast border checks. Once across the border, the Israeli teams reported good cooperation with the Egyptian forces.
They let us in after half an hour, and I must say that they helped us. It took a bit time, but after they decided to let us in, they help us to take out the fire and help us in any way they can.
Some 90 minutes after the Taba attack, 2 explosions in rapid succession rocked the Bedouin resort at Ras Al Satan, where hundreds of Israeli holidaymakers were enjoying a quiet evening. It's believed that a pair of suicide bombers carried out this attack. 2 Israelis were reported killed and some 30 wounded. Hundreds of others dashed into the sea for fear of further explosions. Sources close to the security establishment today said the attack was on the cards for some time. They fell short of accusing the Israeli holidaymakers in Sinai of negligence, but reminded them of the security warning that was issued last month concerning a possible terror attack in the Sinai. Dennis Zinn, IBA News.
Shortly after last night's bombings, Jerusalem Post reporter Matt Gutman headed to Eilat and the Israeli-Egyptian border crossing at Taba. Matt Gutman joins us now by telephone. Matt, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Matt, where are you at right now?
I'm just outside the Taba crossing. I just crossed back into Israel from Taba.
Do Israelis still suspect there are bodies in the rubble of the Taba Hilton Hotel where you're just at?
Yes, they're still digging. One of the problems is that it was a 13-story building, and about at least 10 floors collapsed, pancaked onto each other, and they have to dig through several layers of them in order to find remnants of human remains, if they are indeed there. Rescue workers I just spoke to about 15 minutes ago said that they do believe there are still people trapped in the rubble. They have no idea how many, but they will keep digging until they really believe that this site is clear of human remains.
Matt, is there cooperation between Israeli and Egyptian security authorities?
Stated as such, there is definitely cooperation between the Israeli and Egyptian authorities. However, I would say at the start of this terrorist attack, there was very, very poor coordination. The Egyptians would not allow Israelis in, barely at all. First, they were allowing 1 ambulance at a time. Few rescue workers were getting in, and rescue workers and firemen admitted openly to me throughout the day that they had to smuggle themselves in, dressed as ambulance workers in order to try to save people and get them out of the rubble. At first, the coordination was positively dismal. It improved to slightly better than dismal throughout the afternoon, and by evening, I think it's certainly gotten much better. One of the major complaints that the Israeli rescue forces have had is that there has been a large-scale amount of looting on the side of, I'm not going to say who, but there has been looting in the hotel. Passports have been stolen, as have wallets and clothes and suitcases. So there's a lot left unclear and a lot of accusations being flung by either side, even though on the macro level I think they're dealing with the situation.
One final question. Overnight there were reports of arrests. To the best of your knowledge, has anyone been detained until now?
To the best of my knowledge, I do not know. There have been very little reports of arrests. Most of the people that we've been talking to today have been dealing primarily with trying to either locate or dislodge or remove bodies or live people from the rubble. The rescue effort continues, and this is, I think, the primary goal of most people, although I think the Egyptians are probably working very hard to try to apprehend those responsible.
Matt Gutman from Taba, thanks so much and take care of yourself there.
Thank you. Good night.
This morning, Israeli security officials called on Israelis still vacationing in Sinai to return home for fear of additional terror attacks. For many tourists, the appeal was not necessary as 8,000 Israelis hurried back to cross into Israel from Egypt since last night. Tourism officials estimate that at the time of the deadly attacks, there were more than 15,000 Israelis in Sinai taking advantage of the Sukkot holiday. Foreign Minister Savan Shalom asked his Egyptian counterpart to allow Israelis to pass through the border crossing without passport checks to allow a quicker evacuation. Some 30 buses were sent to the crossing to transport the tourists into Israel, while Israeli airlines this morning beefed up flights for citizens who wanted to return to Tel Aviv ahead of the Sabbath.
Around 10 o'clock we heard something. We don't know if we heard something or just a buzz that was going around. And then people started to get information by the phone about the first explosion in the Taba Hotel.
We were staying at the Taba Hilton family holiday, and approximately about 9:30 I was closing my doors and suddenly felt this incredible shudder and incredible sort of dust and everything in the ceiling didn't come down, but it was sort of, the whole room was disarranged. And everybody was screaming.
There was a terrorist attack on the beach where we were staying in Ras Satan. 2 explosions, very strong. One of our friends died. Many were injured. It took a lot of time until the rescuers came. And they were arguing all the time. They wanted to take the injured to Nueva. It was catastrophe.
I think it was an explosion from a car. It was just right behind us.
The first time, yesterday we sat on the room and we heard a very big bomb. And all of the persons get out from the rooms and go to see what is the meaning of the bomb. And we was on the line on the beach, all the people, and then we heard, we saw and heard the second bomb in the Ras of Satan.
Yeah. Mushrooms of light and smoke. It was huge. It's like it came from the sea.
The UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees announced the successful delivery of aid to approximately 3,300 people unable to leave their homes in Jabalia refugee camp since September 28, when Israeli occupation troops launched a Days of Penitence aggression against northern Gaza Strip.
The sound of rapid gunfire echoes throughout Gaza as Israeli occupation presses ahead with its biggest and bloodiest offensive in the Strip in 4 years. In Jabalia refugee camp, Palestinians are picking through the rubble outside their homes and carrying white flags in an attempt to travel safely through the debris-filled streets as Israeli tanks rolled through the camp. On Thursday, residents of the camp marched in the funeral of 2 teenagers killed by Israeli occupation troops. Carrying the bodies of the 2 15-year-olds across Jabalia, Palestinians vowed revenge. Watching their kins and friends being killed daily, young Palestinians said they are very scared. The vivid images of their neighbors torn to pieces by tank shells or wrapped with blood have been haunting their minds for days by now.
What can I say? We've been surrounded for 9 days. Nobody looked after us but God.
Sparking a gleam of hope, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, was delivering food and water to half of the 600 Palestinian families trapped in their homes in the Jabalia refugee camp.
We are now providing people with food for at least 45 days. So for some time at least, they should have enough food at home.
In Khan Yunis, in southern Gaza Strip, Israeli occupation troops killed a Palestinian fighter. An Israeli military source said 2 armed men were apparently trying to infiltrate the security fence separating the Gaza Strip from territories occupied since 1948. Palestinian medics said for their part that 3 Palestinians had been moderately wounded in the same operation, which was not claimed by any group. More than 92 Palestinians, mostly civilians, have been killed in the Israeli offensive against Gaza, which have mustered more than 2,000 Israeli occupation troops. The Arab League expressed its frustration at the U.S. veto Tuesday of the Arab-sponsored draft resolution at the United Nations Security Council against the Israeli army operation. Saeed Kamal, Deputy Secretary General for the Palestinian Affairs at the Cairo-based organization, said, quote, "We're fed up. We can't keep count anymore of the number of times the Americans have used their veto on behalf of Israel at the Security Council." For his part, former Palestinian Security Minister Mohammed Dahlan said he did not think Israel will achieve anything with this operation that will not bring security, but a violent retaliation and revenge operations.
Now for the developments in occupied Iraq, US-led occupation forces launched a new air raid on the city of Fallujah on Friday and targeted a wedding gathering, killing 12 people, including the bride, and injuring 17 others, including the groom.
A U.S. airstrike on the city of Fallujah in western Iraq in the early hours on Friday killed at least 11 people at a wedding gathering. Many women and children were among the casualties. The U.S. fire, which also wounded 17 people, did not even spare the bride and groom.
At my wedding, we were attacked by an American warplane. We don't have any weapons, and we do not belong to Az-Zarqawi.
One house was flattened in the attack and 2 others were damaged. The U.S. military described the offensive, the latest of several staged against the city, as a precision strike that hit a safe house being used by loyalists of Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. Earlier, military officials said U.S. and Iraqi troops had captured nearly 16 suspected fighters in the first 3 days of a joint assault on areas south of Baghdad. 4 Marines, 3 Iraqi National Guardsmen, and 3 civilians have been so far injured in the fighting. Meanwhile, at least 2 rockets slammed into the Sheraton Hotel in central Baghdad, damaging the building and causing a fire nearby. Iraqi police said rockets were fired from the back of a truck parked in a square about 500 meters from the hotels. In a separate incident, an Iraqi police officer was shot dead and 2 others injured on Friday when their patrol came under attack near the northern city of Kirkuk. Elsewhere, a U.S. soldier was killed and his interpreter wounded in a roadside bomb attack Thursday near the northern oil refinery town of Beijing.
A top aide to Sayyid Muqtada Sadr announced that the Mahdi army would hand over its weapons as part of a peace initiative in Baghdad, Sadr city and other areas. Sheikh Ali Smaysim said that in return, the interim Iraqi government must make assurances that Sadr's followers are not persecuted and prisoners are freed from U.S. detention. He added that the deal would become effective only once the government agreed. Meanwhile, U.S. occupation forces released an aide to Sayyid Sadr Sheikh Muayyid al-Khazraji, who was detained nearly a year ago along with other clerics from the Sadr stream. A newly released Associated Press poll has found that Senator John Kerry has taken a slim lead over U.S. President George W. Bush in the U.S. presidential election campaign. The new poll came after the new Central Intelligence Agency report asserted that Iraq possesses no weapons of mass destruction. Bush acknowledged the report but argued he was still right to go to war, and Kerry dismissed Bush's remarks on the Dulfer report as an absolute full-spin mode.
Chief Weapons Inspector Charles Dulfer has now issued a comprehensive report that confirms the earlier conclusion of David Kay that Iraq did not have the weapons that our intelligence believed were there. The Dulfer report also raises important new information about Saddam Hussein's defiance of the world and his intent and capability to develop weapons. The Dulfer report showed that Saddam was systematically gaming the system, using the UN Oil for Food program to try to influence countries and companies in an effort to undermine sanctions.
The President of the United States and the Vice President of the United States may well be the last two people on the planet who won't face the truth about Iraq. Mr. President, the American people deserve more than spin about this war. They deserve facts that represent reality, not carefully polished arguments and points that are simply calculated to align with a preconceived perception. Sending men and women into combat is the gravest responsibility of all, and asking the American people for their truth with respect to that requires that you tell them the truth.
British hostage Kenneth Bigley has been beheaded by his kidnappers near Baghdad. His brother confirmed the reports by Arabic television channels that Bigley had been decapitated. British Prime Minister Tony Blair said those who resorted to hostage-taking around the world must not be allowed to win. Sources earlier said Bigley was killed yesterday afternoon in the town of Latifiya, southwest of Baghdad. A video released by militants showed Bigley making a statement as 6 militants stood behind him before one cut his head off with a knife. The 62-year-old engineer was kidnapped from his residence along with 2 Americans in Baghdad on September 16th by the Tawheed and Jihad group. The 2 American hostages were beheaded. The kidnappers had demanded U.S.-led forces in Iraq release women prisoners in Iraqi jails to spare Bigley's life, with Bigley videotaped last week appealing to Blair to save his life. Blair said his government would not negotiate with the hostage takers. A U.S. airstrike on the Iraqi city of Fallujah has killed 11 people and wounded 17 after a wedding party. The U.S. said the attack was targeting foreign militants led by Abu Mus'ab Zarqawi. Rescuers dug bodies from the rubble with their hands after the raid on the house where residents said the wedding party had just been held. They said the groom died and the bride was wounded. At the local hospital where blood pooled in on the floor, a doctor said 9 females aged between 5 and 50 were among the wounded. The U.S. military said a precision strike hit a safe house used by associates of Zarqawi in northwest Fallujah. Repeated U.S. airstrikes on Fallujah have coincided with efforts by Iraq's interim government to arrange the return of its security forces to the rebel-held city and other trouble spots ahead of a January deadline for nationwide elections. The attack came hours after U.S. warplanes struck Baghdad's southern city district, killing 2 people. Residents said a U.S. warplane fired a missile at the city just before midnight, damaging a number of shops. The government welcomed an offer by a Shiite militia led by Muqtada Sadr to disarm and indicated their willingness to meet at least some of the cleric's demands in any deal. The proposal was announced by a top Sadr aide following the release of a pro-Sadr cleric from U.S. detention in Abu Ghraib jail. The aide said centers would be set up to collect weapons. And in further attacks, insurgents attacked a U.S. military patrol north of Baghdad, killing 1 soldier and wounding another. NATO has approved an operational plan to send around 300 military trainers to Iraq. Alliance ambassadors meeting in Brussels agreed out on outlines of a plan to create a training academy for top Iraqi officers. A spokesman was who has further details and rules out the engagement still needed to be worked out. He said no start date was agreed to, but the alliance wanted to launch the mission as soon as possible. A senior NATO official said the aim was to start training before Iraqi elections due in January.
Syrian capital of Damascus late on Thursday, President Khatami met and held talks with his Syrian counterpart Bashar al-Assad on the two countries' cooperation, regional and international issues, developments in the occupied Iraq and Palestine in particular. Condemning the massacre of the innocent Palestinians, Khatami and Assad also called on Muslim countries to join efforts to settle the Darfur crisis in Sudan. On Iraq, President Khatami stressed U.S. failure in bringing democracy to the war-shattered country. Among other issues, President Khatami highlighted the need for Tehran and Damascus to implement the already sealed deals between the two sides. President Assad, too, voiced his country's willingness to reinforce ties with Iran and stressed efforts by Tehran and Damascus to restore security to Iraq. General Director of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Mohammad El-Baradei, says the UN atomic watchdog has seen no diversion in Iran's nuclear technology towards weapons production. Iranian Fars news agency quotes El-Baradei, who was talking at a UN University of Tokyo, as saying no material has been found in Iran's nuclear sites that can serve as proof for the country is producing atomic weaponry. Iran has frequently announced that under international laws, it is entitled to apply nuclear technology for peaceful purposes, such as generating power. Tehran has also stressed producing nuclear weaponry has no place in its defensive doctrine. And moving to Iraq, Ken Bigley, a British hostage kidnapped in Baghdad last month, has been killed. Bigley, 62, was kidnapped in the Iraqi capital on September the 16th, along with 2 U.S. colleagues who have since been beheaded by their captors. This is while 12 people were killed Friday, and the bride at a wedding party was among the wounded when U.S. warplanes bombed the Iraqi city of Fallujah early Friday. U.S. military said it was a precision strike targeting leaders of Iraq's most wanted man, the al-Qaeda-linked militant Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Doctors said 16 people were also wounded, and the bride was among 9 injured females. Meanwhile, a U.S. soldier was killed and another wounded in an attack in northern Iraq when, as a U.S. military statement said, anti-Iraqi forces attacked their patrol near Tus. Still in Iraq, a U.S. missile killed 3 men who an American officers said were planting a bomb in the Baghdad Shiite district of Sadr city before dawn on Friday. Meanwhile, 2 rockets hit Baghdad's Sheraton Hotel, followed by gunfire, but there were no reports of any serious casualties. Meanwhile, Taliban insurgents fired rockets in parts of Afghanistan, and a huge truck bomb was intercepted on the eve of the first presidential election in the rocked, war-torn country.
A young girl and an elderly man were wounded when a rocket slammed into a house in Jalalabad. The missile was one of 4 that were fired in the attack. In Kabul, rockets were fired towards the Japanese and German embassies and a U.S. military base. A centre for journalists covering the weekend's landmark presidential election was hit. Some 50,000 police and peacekeepers are providing security for the polls, but the attacks highlight the threat posed by Taliban militants who are vowing to disrupt voting.
The views expressed on Mosaic are not those of Link TV or its sponsors, but of the broadcasters themselves. Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Additional support is provided by the Firedoll Foundation and Henry and Virgilia Dakin.